Is the war differently affect boys and girls? How different they are, or it doesn't really matter?
Boys are much more likely to say violent things. Let's kill all Russians, let's kill Putin. Validation is trying to understand what it is that the child goes through and look at the world through their eyes. One very important part of it is reconnecting the child with their life. There are so many thousands of children who are still in Russia, really, really being kidnapped and brainwashed by these people.
Children being arrested because they were suspected of spying for Ukrainian armed forces.
In Russia, the level of cruelty and torture goes beyond what people can imagine in the West. Prisons for teenagers are much, much more violent than for adults.
Hello, I'm Jenny Klochko. You're watching my podcast, the platform for guest stories beyond your daily newsfeed. Today, I would like us to look at the consequences on mental health, the war, the Russian aggression in Ukraine, especially on teenagers, because they are the most vulnerable, they are not as small, they understand what's happening. And as it's turned out, in occupation and those territories where Russians have access, the children, the young adults, teenagers, they are the main focus of Russian propaganda, Russian brainwashing, and these children, these humans, these Ukrainians need the most of protection. And I think it's important if we carry on these discussions and we carry on covering it and reminding how awful and what we're dealing with. And my guest today is Dennis Ougrin, professor of child and adolescent psychiatry and global mental health at Queen Mary University of London. He's visiting professor at King's College London. Hello, Dennis. Thank you for finding time talking to me today.
Hello, it's a big pleasure.
What are the marks or scars of war on mental health? Let's like in general, is it PTSD, depression, anxiety, what else?
I'd say that any war will increase the risk of most psychiatric disorders. The associating stress that, as you rightly pointed out, most Ukrainian children live under will increase the risk of most of these disorders. PTSD, of course, is a slightly special case in the sense that it is often linked to specific events that happen to children. And again, as you mentioned in your introduction, Ukrainian children have suffered and are still suffering incredible trauma. I've encountered personally, several children who were, went through the kind of trauma that you would not even imagine. And the cruelty that Russian soldiers are capable of is somewhat unbelievable. It's not something that you would predict that a human being would do to another human being. That especially, I have to say, is applicable to all the boys who often are suspected of not liking Russians or collaborating or giving information to Ukrainian soldiers. But also, some of the cruelty is directed at girls as well, including sexual cruelty, and something that I really hope that one day the world will know more about all of these crimes and they will be investigated, and that the people responsible will be brought to account.
Can parents on individual level and as the Ukrainian society, Ukrainians do a lot in terms of mental health. There's a lot of awareness about mental health. There's a lot of services to help to cope with it. But as a global community, can we prevent, protect, or even minimize the exposure of violence, displacement, loss of social network?
I'd say that there are a few things that parents should be aware of when it comes to children and adolescents, as you say. Now, perhaps the most important thing that parents should know about is the importance of routines and predictability. This is something that most children need anyway, but at times of war, this becomes especially important. I've encountered quite a few parents who would want to create special treatment and excitement for children, especially when they move to a new country. But that is something we caution against. What we know is that what children respond best is predictability and routine, especially when it comes to sleep around in the evening. And I must say that fathers are often the most guilty party here because they often come late from work and they like to play with the child, which is understandable. But that could be quite disruptive to their evening routines. And so if say the routine includes maybe a meal, a drink, some sort of a story, a prayer if the family is religious, a bath or something like that, and then a sleep, then we encourage, especially fathers, to maybe read a story as opposed to play football in the evening. Now, the second most important thing is that children will have questions about what happens, what is happening, what has happened. And it is really very important to be truthful to them, not to lie to children. Again, it is very easy to start this sort of cycle of deception, which most of the time comes from a very good place in the parent's heart. They want to protect the child from the horrors of what's happening around them. And especially that is true if somebody dies in the family, for example, a family member who dies, then and in the short term, it is of course easier to lie to a child. But in the longer term, it creates very significant problems, which are a lot more difficult to overcome. So I would encourage parents to be truthful within the developmental level of the child, of course, but not to lie. And also to be able to answer some of the questions that every child will have and tell their stories. So very often we find parents, not just Ukrainian parents, any parents whose children go through difficulties, that one group of parents will say, let's not talk about this at all, let's not discuss it, because that sort of seems to re-traumatize the child. And then the other smaller group, but growing, is the parents who want to make the child talk about this because supposedly it's a healthy thing. And we know from research that neither of these two extremes are good. But every child at some point will want to speak about what happened to them. And when that happens, we really encourage parents to find the time, quiet time, to listen to the child very carefully, answer their questions truthfully, and help them create a narrative, like a story in their mind that will create just a continuous story, which is a lot easier for the child to digest than having these sort of bits of memories. I have to say from experience that a very good time to speak to a child is when they are driving next to a parent, when they're not facing each other, but when they face forward, and that's a lot easier to speak at those times, or some other times when they are sort of not encountering each other face to face. And maybe one more thing to say to parents is that during times of war, again, we know from loads of research that parenting styles become more aggressive and more authoritarian. It's something that happens all the time. And it's good to be aware of these things, but also to understand that some of the sort of extra harshness comes from parents not looking after themselves. Again, it's something that is very easy to do. Many parents would say, we just want our children to be okay, and they forget about their own needs. And that's something that I would really encourage parents to do, to look after themselves, whatever works for them, to recharge their own batteries.
Do you know, it's interesting because you and I were both thinking about those children who are in Ukraine and who has to hide from the air raids attacks, and sometimes on this, like when it's heavily shelling in Ukraine, in Kiev, children and parents spending time in the underground station. But I just I wanted to share the experience from my life when full-scale invasion happened, and my daughter was 9, and I started going to Ukraine, and my the first several trips were months long. And it's just about as a for the journalist, as a at that time newsgatherer and producer for ITV, it's just enough to get the work done, rather than 2 weeks or something like that. And what's happened upon my there was second or third return, I've heard accidentally at night that my child was crying at night, like heavily. And when we started sort of investigating with my husband, and it's turned out she had a friend, the friend moved, and her mother was working in the US Embassy. So those two little girls was reading BBC News, and they were discussing something, and they come up with a conclusion that Putin is going to bomb London, and they sort of couldn't cope, and was my daughter. So obviously we gave all the help, support, and the situation was resolved. But you would think, you know, your father, I wasn't on the front line. I was just going to Ukraine. My all assignments were in Kiev. That little girl is half English, half American. So you would think they're so far from the danger, they're so far from Putin, and being 9-year-old, and still was affecting them.
Mm. Yes, well, it's something that we see all the time. It doesn't surprise me in the least. Um, what I think is important to understand is that children, especially children of that age, have very vivid imaginations, and that could be a good thing, or when they imagine amazing things and plan things, but it could also be tricky, because obviously, as you say, some of that imagination could create these horror images, and we call them something. There's an interesting. Everybody has heard about flashbacks, when you sort of remember something, how it happened. Sometimes you could also have flash forwards, where you sort of imagine something happening in the future. More than that, I'd say that I've seen many hundreds of Ukrainian children in London since the beginning of the big war. And I'd say that many of them have nightmares, and some of these nightmares are to do with what happened in Ukraine, and especially crossing the front line or being shot at by the Russian forces. But some of these nightmares are precisely about Putin bombing London or launching rockets. It's probably one of the most common nightmares that children have, interestingly. And so again, one thing to advise here for parents, especially, is to encourage the child to tell them about these nightmares and about these flash forwards, or whatever horrifies them. And we have this sort of trick in our field, where we ask the child a question. Well, tell me, whose nightmare is this, or whose imagery is this? And the child says, what do you mean? It says, well, is it mine? Is it not my nightmare? It says, no. Is it your father's nightmare? No. Well, whose nightmare is this? And then the child says, well, it's my nightmare. And I say, aha, if it's your nightmare, then you can imagine, then you can pretend and imagine how it may end. So you are in charge, right? And so what parents might do is to encourage the child to tell them, first of all, about what these images or these nightmares are. And sometimes kids are too scared to say, so it might take a little bit of time to to find the right place and time for them to be able to tell. And then also it's very good to draw it, to have a drawing of the nightmare or the imagery, and then also to work with the child on how they want to finish it, how they want to end it. So, for example, we can invite the child to imagine a superhero or a person that will enter the nightmare and stop these bombs and rockets. Interestingly, with kids that I worked with, the most common superhero is actually President Zelensky of all people, but could be other people too. But the point again, like with traumatic memories too, is to create this coherent narrative with a happy end of some sort, and that will significantly reduce the number and severity of nightmares.
Interesting. While preparing to our conversation today, I've seen, obviously, I checked your previous media appearances, and earlier you said that the UK girls' suicide rate is the highest for the past, comparing the 160 years. Is the war differently affect boys and girls? How different they are, or it doesn't really matter?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I mean, as you rightly say, there is something happening with suicide in 10 to 14-year-old girls, especially, that we have never seen before. There's this exponential, because we should have data on last year very soon. So, we're really curious to see what's happening there. But we have never seen this sort of increase ever before. It's very, very concerning, and isn't happening with boys in the same way. Now, what I think, and obviously one of the theories is that it might be the impact of social media and the internet in general, exposure to on children, and there is more and more evidence to say that it appears like social media might have a differential effect on boys and girls, with more impact on girls. That's not a very sort of solid conclusion just yet, but there are indications to that effect. Now, as far as differential effect of trauma on boys and girls, then there is undoubtedly a difference in how children process information. I was very struck once, again, at the very, very beginning of the full-scale invasion. We had a group of children from Ukraine, small children, even younger than your child, who we organized art groups for them. Not art therapy, just art. So they were allowed to draw whatever they want. They were making T-shirts and then playing some instruments and stuff like that. I have to say that the imagery that boys produce seems to be very different from the imagery that girls produce. So boys, perhaps unsurprisingly, would place like these big tanks on their T-shirts or on drawings or rifles, assault rifles, planes, and so on. And I remember that there was a little boy from Kharkiv. He drew a particular tank, and he said, "Well, it's that kind of modification of a tank." And I've never heard about that. It's like, what? This is like so so obviously the children, whereas girls don't tend to produce that sort of violent imagery when they draw, when they make things. That is not to say that they are affected any less than boys, but it's just that it seems to me that the sort of the processing and the imagery that appears as a result seems to be different. And I have to say that could put boys at significant risk as well. So there was a case of a 14-year-old boy who brought a gun, a toy, a replica a gun to school, and ended up in a lot of trouble because of that, because other children were scared, and were teachers, and of course that is sort of multiplied by the fact that he is Ukrainian, and so somehow teachers think that Ukrainian boys might actually have a real gun. And so it's something that has to be taken into account. I'm sure if a girl did that, the repercussions would have been not as severe. Yeah, so to be mindful, just to be mindful that when children process these things, they could produce different imagery and also could say different things too. Boys are much more likely to say violent things. Let's kill all Russians, let's kill Putin, let's kill, and that could be quite worrying, especially in some Western countries. I think these types of statements. I think girls are much less likely to say that.
But what was on the girls' art pieces? What did they created?
Oh, they created all kinds of. I mean, very often they would still create, for example, their home towns or home cities or villages, sometimes destroyed, and sometimes about what actually they witnessed. But equally, I have to say that at the end of these classes, we invited them to draw the future and how they see their hometowns or villages in the future after Ukrainian victory. And again, I think girls were a lot more capable to imagine these sort of happy endings. I have a selection of drawings of Mariupol, for example, with beautiful flower beds and ATB and Zutya on, which is like Ukrainian. I didn't know what ATB was, but it's like a Ukrainian brand of the supermarket. And like happy people. Whereas I think boys tended to be sort of less likely to produce we didn't particularly work with them, just invited them to do this, and they seem to be less likely to produce these sort of wholesome images of the future.
How interesting. Quite often, I'm sure any adult, you don't have to be a parent to hear this phrase, and that children are resilient. And it doesn't matter if we're referring to the divorce of parents or the death in the family. But when these resilient children in the future come to the counselor for their therapy, apparently there's they are and they come there just with those childhood trauma, with the inability to build up relationship or functioning or progress in their career. And when it starts, the work when with the specialist starting, it's getting back to something parents did or something they went through as a small one. So don't you think the children's mind is like minefield? They are not resilient. We just don't know when they explode and how they explode. And it's kind of a false statement that children are resilient. Maybe we just saying it just because in the moment as adults we're losing ourselves, we're falling apart visually, while the children, they kind of numb and they still functioning. Or I'm totally wrong.
No, you're not wrong. And of course, children are very different. You can't make these sort of sweeping statements. Some are very resilient, surprisingly so. I mean, I've come across incredible examples of resilience, and some are not at all resilient. What I wanted to say is just that children appear to be less affected by the various traumas for several reasons. One of them is, of course, for example, when you look at suicide, which is a very extreme example of this, but typically in most countries, the older you are, the higher your risk of suicide, and the younger you are, the lower the risk. So, for example, in the UK, we've never had more than 200 individual cases of children under the age of 18 who died of suicide. Which is, as you can imagine, out of 17 million individuals, it's a very small number, and it's difficult to predict. Equally, some of the more severe psychiatric disorders like bipolar disorder or schizophrenia are much less likely in children than in adults. In fact, the peak onset of some of these more severe disorders is sort of 20s and 30s, and they're much more rare in children, adolescents. But nonetheless, there are some disorders that are much more common in kids. And one example is self-harm. It's not a disorder per se, but it's an expression of emotional dysregulation that it peaks in teenage years, for instance. Also, there are other types of disorders that are more likely to be diagnosed in children. For example, ADHD, which is hyperactivity and inattention that seems to improve the older you are. So it's actually quite a mixed picture. But I would say that children also, are less likely, for example, to be lonely than adults are, and children are a lot more likely to be connected socially than many adults are. Especially older adults. It's a real problem in Western countries, this sort of isolation and loneliness that older adults have. Kids by the nature of their life, they're exposed to other children all the time in kindergarten, in school. There is a proportion of kids who still struggle very badly with connecting with other children. For example, kids with developmental problems, with social anxiety and others. But nonetheless, they seem to be better connected on average than adults, and especially older adults. And that, I have to say, as far as we could say, is one of the principal protective factors that protects your mental well-being, is social connection, social support, and being with other people.
Well, here's the question from my friend. She is a therapist. She has patients, and that's sort of a question. Self-harming is very common amongst teenagers, but as a therapist for adults, I hear lots of different reasons. Control, peer pressure, loneliness. All of my adult clients deeply regret the behavior and have great frustration with the scars being a constant reminder. How do you help teenagers through self-harming phases, and do you ever speak to them about how their adult self will see the scars daily?
Well, self-harm is very common and increasing in prevalence as well. So in the last 20 years, we think it may have increased nearly 2 times. So from about 10% of children to about 18%. So about 18% of kids will have self-harmed at least once by the time they finish school. And that is more common in girls than boys, for instance. Now, self-harm takes many forms and shapes, and is really, there are common types like self-injury or self-scratching or self-burning. Then there are overdoses, which is a form of self-harm too. And they could be either suicidal or non-suicidal. And then there are sort of more rare types of self-harm, sometimes very peculiar and very traumatic, that children may engage with. And really, some self-harm could take exceptionally violent and very dangerous forms too. Especially, I have to say, in children with developmental problems such as autism, and sometimes a very dangerous form of self-harm occurs in response to hallucinations or delusions in children who have psychotic disorders. Those could be very dangerous indeed. And another important factor here is substance misuse. So children who have access to drugs or alcohol, that could significantly increase the risk too, because they're disinhibiting substances and could make self-harm much worse and dangerous. Now, you obviously are referring to one type of self-harm, which is cutting, self-cutting, which often leaves scars, although not always, but often does. And when we, I know people with self-harm all the way from from pre-teenage children to adults and older adults. And many of them eventually go into our field and work in our field. For instance, I know a social worker who used to self-harm very badly when she was a teenager, and she has these obviously scars over time. They reduce and they become white, and sometimes they're not easy to detect as well. But she tells me, Dennis, I sometimes look at my arms and my legs, and I cannot imagine it was me. It was like a different person. It's just something that I cannot imagine I was actually doing it to myself. And people with lived experience like that are often very good for therapeutic work because they know so much about what children go through and how they overcame these problems themselves, and that could be a helpful. It's not that they will tell the children, you have to do this to stop. It doesn't work like that at all. But they will have often a lot of empathy with the child and validate their experience. And this sort of validation and empathy are so key for the child to experience. As opposed to shock or punishment, which makes things significantly worse.
But how about those children who going through this self-harming stage? Is a compelling case to tell them, oh, you will regret in 15, 20 years time? How to approach this subject if, for example, you as an adult, you see your child or maybe your nephew or niece is like going through this? How to look at them from the other perspective, to kind of like maybe giving them the light at the end of this tunnel they are in?
I'd say that when children self-harm, what I would advise parents to do more than anything else is to validate their experience. Now, I need to explain what it actually is. So validation is not the same as agreeing with their behavior. It's two very different things. Validation is trying to understand what it is that the child goes through and look at the world through their eyes and try to understand with the child what it is that happens in their mind that results in self-harm in a warm, understanding and accepting way. Not accepting of the self-harm, but accepting of the child, and separating these two things. In fact, it's a good idea to keep these two things separate. So a child is not a self-harmer. There is self-harm and there is child. And exploring when self-harm came to the child's life, what it does, in what way, it has an impact on the child. It's very important to separate these two concepts. So I'd say that a lot of what parents could do is try to validate and empathize with the child. I'd say, most of the time, self-harm comes because of interpersonal problems of some sort in a neurotypical child. So a child with a typical development in their teenage years will often self-harm in a response to a conflict of some sort. In fact, unfortunately, the most common source of these conflicts is parents themselves. So when we look at when we ask children, who are these fights with, it's actually number one is a parent. But it's not that it's somehow the parent's fault. Not at all. I think the vast majority of parents do their best and want their best for the child. It's just that sometimes the way that parents go about conflicts with the child could inadvertently result in this emotional burst that the child cannot cope. And then self-harm very often is a very effective tool to reduce this arousal and to make them feel better. So the vast majority of children will tell you that the reason why they self-harm is because they feel better afterwards in some ways. Sometimes these reasons are complex. There is an element of self-punishment. Sometimes there is an element of some kids like to see the sight of blood. Some, in fact, at some level enjoy the power that it gives and the shock that they see in parents' eyes. So it's complex, but in the vast majority of cases, there is something good about self-harm that keeps it going. And it's important to understand and acknowledge that fact. And then inevitably, as you were saying, there are things about self-harm that are not so good and that have an adverse impact on the child's life. And these things are also very important to understand and discuss with the child. And I'd say from experience that the most common sort of longer-term negative impact of self-harm is increasing social withdrawal and isolation. Many children who self-harm tend to be deactivated from their life, except for maybe a small number of other children who self-harm, which sometimes happens maybe as part of a cultural subgroup of some sort. So really what we always start with these children is really understanding, empathizing, and validating what's happening with them. And then obviously it's if professional help is available, I would really recommend that parents do seek it. Especially because self-harm could be linked with a number of other disorders that are really important to understand and investigate. For example, autism is one disorder that is linked with very high risk of self-harm. And also the triggers for self-harm in autism could be quite different from neurotypical children. For example, sensory overload could be a very common trigger for that, or disruptions to routines of a child. And so it's really important to check it out. And then really what I would say that parents could do more than anything else is maybe read a little bit about a particular psychological therapy called dialectical behavior therapy, or DBT. And look at, there are loads of self-help books about self-harm and DBT. And DBT is a very effective psychological therapy for self-harm and related disorders. And it's based on skills, on certain skills that children might develop to regulate their emotions better and interpersonal relationships. And it's something that that could be very useful for parents to learn a little bit about and together with their children. And also, one very important part of it is reconnecting the child with their life, especially those kids who withdraw from life and maybe just sit at home on the computer in isolation. I think it's super important to begin to reintegrate them with a wider world. And so one could look at whatever activities the child used to enjoy before, but stopped. Or one could even explore with the child what activities they might enjoy in the future as well. And they don't have to be expensive. Most of these activities are free, like a walk in the park or going fishing or doing some other things with parents, is playing football, is going for a walk or a run. They are free. It's really good if some of these activities are social as well, like with other children. That's very useful. They have to be legal, of course. Some children will just pull parents' leg and say, "Just get me some cannabis, and I'll feel better." And I would also say that they need to be Like I would caution against expensive trips, holidays, these kinds of things. I would look at sort of more sort of mundane everyday things that could be maintained. So between a regular jog in the park with a friend or with a parent, and an expensive trip to Los
Disneyland.
Angeles, Disneyland in Los Angeles, I would go for the jog every time.
It's again bring us back to the routine and regularity and something the child can rely on.
Exactly right. Yes.
Okay, as a producer of the documentary about the first anniversary Russian invasion in Ukraine, and there was a story of the girl who lost entire family, two siblings, younger siblings. She is the eldest girl. Both parents, they were leaving, trying to leave Kiev in a car, but Russians were targeting civilian cars, and basically on her eyes, both parents killed, siblings killed, and she was badly injured in her spine. So there's the girl Sonia, and all she left is grandmas, and one of the grandmas taking care of her. And the girl, she couldn't speak, she couldn't move for a very long time. And thanks to the Italian doctors, Italian authorities, she's still going back there for the very slowly recovery. They do progress, but her state was so severe that she was fighting for life for months. And there's another case of, so that I'm sort of giving the context to compare two traumas of children of the Russian war in Ukraine. And there's another case, two girls, one was I think 8 something like that and the other 18th, and they from Bucha, their father joined territorial defense. They joined their mother, and with mother left, I think they were abroad at that time, and their father was killed in Bucha, like many mothers, and he was one of those men in the mass grave. And since they got back, and those two girls, spending a lot of time on father's grave, day and night, it doesn't matter. So when we were talking to them, clearly their life is ruined. They try to sort of like patch it together, but as much as they can. So are those traumas of those children different? Or they really, in medical terms, as a psychiatrist, it doesn't really matter because the sort of the wounds, the holes which needs to be healed and patched are quite similar.
Oh, the impact of an individual trauma on the child. There are certain characteristics of traumas that are much more likely to produce PTSD. And those kinds of traumas are often involving interpersonal violence, like you're describing, especially sexual violence, um, uh, but physical violence too. Um, Events that are beyond the child's control, events that the child cannot comprehend, and they seem to be just come from, like, for example, a rocket or something that comes from the sky, and especially for a small child, it's very difficult to get their head around what it actually is. So there are some characteristics of these events that we know especially likely to produce PTSD and other problems in the child. But having said this, there is an incredible individual variability in the kind of trauma and the impact on the child. I know loads of children who have gone through incredible trauma back home in Ukraine and seem to be, broadly speaking, unaffected by these traumas. And I know some children who, by comparison, went through a very minor trauma, but are very badly affected by that too. So it doesn't at all follow that the kind of trauma will have a very predictable impact on the child. In fact, a lot of variability comes from the way that the child processes this trauma in their head. And again, parents could be very important in helping the child to process these events. But You know, what I would say is that with any trauma, the key to healing is incorporating all of these events into an understandable and logical narrative, so that whatever happened to the child becomes part of their normal memory, not traumatic, disjointed, horrible, avoided bits of information. In fact, most trauma-focused therapies aim to produce this sort of coherent narrative for the child. And in fact, when I work with children with trauma, what I'm aiming at is boredom. I want them to be bored. So when the child is bored with their stories, then I'm happy. Then it means they're not scared anymore. Because what produces long-term negative consequences is this sort of fear of what happened, trying to push it away, disjointed bits, not being able to make sense of what happened. And when the child finally has a story that they can repeat and put it in the right place in their brain, which is called hippocampus, as it happens, then that's the aim. And so I would say that I wouldn't force children to talk about what happened. I wouldn't equally, I wouldn't stop them from talking, and I wouldn't make them talk about what happened. But when the child wants to talk, I would really find the time to listen to them very carefully, so that they can gradually begin to integrate what happened in their brains.
Interesting. You just basically answering one question, but I suspect answering the next question, because I wanted to compare the traumas that caused by the war, and the trauma, for example, if we compare with the damage or again trauma from if child loses a parent, for example, illness or car accident, and that's sort of like. But as you said, it's very individualistic, and the context or the circumstances are not relevant, right?
Yes, exactly. I mean, obviously, a child who, in addition to being exposed to the war, also lost somebody who is close to them, has an extra piece of work, which is, to grieve, to process what happened, and then again to integrate that very traumatic experience, very painful experience, into their memories. Again, on that specific front, what I would say is I would really discourage parents from, again, lying about what happened. If at all possible, please don't do that. Don't say that mommy is just asleep, or she went to Poland or something else. No, really important to be truthful within the child's developmental level, of course. Being truthful about what happened is the first step towards the process that the child needs to go through. It's very individual, depending on the child, and how they will need to grieve. It's a really good idea to, unless there are very specific reasons not to, is to involve the child with the funeral. It's very important for the child to have the memories of that, especially if it's a small child, memories of that person. Again, the story here will be very similar to any other trauma. It's very important to integrate, this person's passing into the child's memories, and have a story that the child could actually have in their mind and tell other people about what happened, without lying or without sort of misconceptions there. It's the procedure, it's a process the child needs to go through. But again, parents have a very important role, or surviving people like grandparents in your first case, have a very important role, I think, to integrate these memories into a coherent narrative.
I hear you, but a first thing comes to my memory is the documentaries and many articles in the media about Princess Diana death and how her boys, that time sons, were traumatized by Prince Philip's decision to follow her coffin, where all these sort of like millions, let's say hundreds of thousands of people were on the side. And there's underlying thought the boys were more traumatized by walking behind the coffin rather than, it's just they were the right of grieving or going through this process without wide public was taken away from them in order to make it better, I guess, or in order to make it like it should be within the royal family. What would you say on that?
Well, I'd say that obviously it's a very special case when you have a very public figure like that. In general, I'd say that involving children with whatever ritual this family has is very healthy and important. And I would, with very rare exceptions, I would recommend that that children need to be part of this process. And remember, every culture has very different rituals to do with funerals. And obviously, what happened to Princess Diana is a very peculiar part of British culture. But in general, I have to say I'm a big fan of British funerals. In fact, when I die, I really hope they have one of the one of the British funerals, and not one of those Ukrainian 3-day events, which I have to say I really dread. With like I'm a big fan of British. I've been to many, and unfortunately, though I have of that age when many of my friends actually are more likely to have a funeral than a wedding. And they're brief. They celebrate the life of a person. There are jokes and their favorite music, and some crying, of course. Uh, and you really sort of have this experience of a celebration of somebody's life more than the sort of protracted, many-day events with everybody has to wait for an auntie from Drohobych or so. It's a horrible experience. But having said this, if this is part of the culture that the child is growing up in, then I would engage them with whatever the procedures that are common in that culture. So if it is in fact a matter of helping parents to to remove mirrors or to burn candles or to have these long drinking and eating events, then that's the culture of the child. And I would encourage them, surviving relatives, to engage the child in all of these things. And the reason for this is because, again, as I said, we want the child to have a continuous narrative of what happened that is integrated in their brain. And if you remove the child from this sort of important ritualistic part, and especially if you then prevent the child from going to the grave and all of these other things that sometimes, unfortunately, parents do, then it just makes it more difficult to integrate and have a coherent narrative for the child.
How about the children who going through Russian occupation? They are teenagers. They understand who's bad, who's good, where's the reality. And it doesn't matter is the family is like pro-Russian or neutral or pro-Ukrainian. So these are the young, sort of almost adults. They have own worldview, own opinion, and they becoming a target for Russians. And I mean this tragic case in Berdyansk, which is occupied still now, and the two boys, teenagers, were shot dead because they were accused of being helping the resistant movement or being partisans. And those two boys, I mean Tigran Oganisyan and Mikita Khanganov. Also, they actually known cases of the children being arrested because they were suspected of spying for Ukrainian armed forces and then torturing them in the cells, sexually abusing them. And how to deal with those cases? I know those children or teenagers who went through prison, and eventually they were, the cases I know, they were lucky for the parents to take them out, and now they're abroad and going through sort of through healing, I hope. But it's very traumatic if they when they come through that.
Exactly. And of course, there is a very special case of these children who'd been kidnapped by Russians and sometimes adopted or fostered in Russian families. I actually recently met a boy like that, 17-year-old boy, who came to London, who was he was from Mariupol as well, and he was stopped by so as they were evacuating the city, he was just with his older brother, and weirdly his older brother, so they strip searched them looking for some tattoos or signs that they were using weapons, and they weirdly let the older brother go, but they kidnapped the well, I suppose he must have been 16 or 15 at the time, that boy, and sent him to a hospital in Donetsk, which is quite interesting because he was saying, well, there's nothing wrong with me. Why would they send me to a hospital? But apparently that's what they do. They they send children to hospitals for some time. And I think in his case, well, he had a happy end to it because his main carer, was actually searching for him and found him, and through some complex mechanisms managed to get him back to Ukraine. But there are so many thousands of children who are still in Russia, really, really being kidnapped and brainwashed by these people. And that's a horrible crime. And in fact, as you know, and your listeners will know, then Putin and one of his helpers were indicted by the International Criminal Court specifically on that charge of kidnapping children, which I have to say is one of the more abhorrent parts of their behavior. Now, with these children, of course, it's a very difficult it's a very difficult part, because the other thing that Russians do, again, your listeners may not be aware of that, is that when a child is adopted, they very often change their name, date of birth, and place of birth. And so that entire thing is erased, and it then becomes very, very difficult to trace and find. There's this sort of special cruelty to this process, which removes all sort of connections with, and especially if a child is small, then that becomes almost impossible to then retrace. Now, and getting them back is a task, is a very big task, very important task. And of course, the older these children, the kidnapped children are, the easier it is to get them back. But these little ones, it's going to be a big challenge, I suppose. Now, the children who end up in Russian prisons for, sometimes on real and sometimes on false charges of helping the resistance, they go through a form of hell, I'd say. Now, Russian prisons, as you know, even for Russian citizens, are exceptionally cruel places. I have to say that it is especially difficult for girls. Now, in most countries, female prisons are more violent than male prisons. And prisons for teenagers are much, much more violent than for adults. And so really the most cruel and violent prisons are for girls, for teenage girls. But I think, that is true about most countries. But I think in Russia, the level of cruelty and torture goes beyond what people can imagine in the West. And so these children, these teenagers who end up in these prisons will need a lot of support if they ever return back to the Ukrainian government controlled part of the country. And most of them will be very severely affected by what happened and will require significant individual work.
And you saying support as a psychiatrist, or you mean like socially and medically support? My sort of like main question in all of this horror for them and for the future of Ukrainian society is that can actually we heal them? Is there possible for them to kind of like help them to take off and live as normal as it's possible and still not losing the joys of life, not to be as guarded and feeling the heaviness of this trauma through the rest of their lives?
Look, I think when it comes to specifically PTSD, then the prognosis is actually quite good. And so most children who have significant symptoms of PTSD now will not have them in the future. That's very important to understand, especially if they have the right sort of social support. And social, I really emphasize that, sort of human support, human connection. But also if they have access to some of the more important ingredients of childhood, and which is sports, arts, and nature. I always joke with my families that if I could put these three things in pills, sports, nature, and art, and give them to kids, then I wouldn't have to give them these toxic chemicals that we sometimes give them. It's a joke, obviously. Some children will need medication, but these other things are really very important. Amongst other things, I'm a scout leader, and that's exactly what I do with my boys. These three things. And so that's one thing to say. But unfortunately, there will be a subgroup of children who will not recover with any amount of non-professional support and non-specific support, and they will need to have access to professionals. Now, there are some interventions that could be delivered by non-mental health professionals. One of them is called teaching recovery techniques, or TRT, and that's something that I brought to Ukraine about more than 10 years ago now, during the first phase of the war in 2014, when the war just started. And there is really quite a good evidence of implementing this program in Ukraine. We've trained hundreds of people, mainly teachers and people who work with kids. Some professionals, but not exclusively so. For example, we trained a big number of school psychologists, which every Ukrainian school has one, interestingly, in a place called Ternopil. We did a big study there. And so what I could say is that one could train non-mental health professionals in delivering brief interventions for these kids, which are really aimed at how to cope with symptoms of re-experiencing the trauma, how to cope with hyperarousal, which many children have, and how to cope with avoidance, physical and cognitive. And so that could be taught relatively straightforwardly. We do these free 2-day courses for whoever wants to be trained, and typically to good effect. The intervention takes only 5 sessions of an hour and a half, and 2 for parents, and could be delivered in groups of 10 to 15 kids. So that's one level. But even that kind of thing will not be sufficient for all kids, and there will be some kids who will need individual work, individual trauma-focused work. Specifically, there is a therapy called cognitive behavior therapy for trauma, which is the #1 therapy in our field. And that is something that we will need maybe to train more specialists in this. There are training courses available, but you need to have a sort of a mental health background for that kind of thing to implement. But as I said, we do, unlike, for example, other conflicts that I'm part of or have been part of, like in Afghanistan or in Syria. In fact, Ukraine has a lot of specialists in comparison. Not all of them left Ukraine, and there are many who work, and some who work remotely using Zoom, like we are doing today. And there is a lot of goodwill too, and so you have loads of specialists coming from all over the world to Ukraine to deliver something. In fact, some psychologists tell me, it's too much. Like we don't know who these people are, what these programs are, what's the evidence base. And they all advertise their services. So unlike many other conflicts, Ukraine is in this sort of slightly special place where loads of people are coming to help. And we have a fair number of professionals in Ukraine, including, as I said, this incredible resource, which many British people don't believe that we do have, which is a school psychologist in pretty much every school, and sometimes more than one school psychologist. And so the infrastructure is actually relatively good. But one word of caution is just that, there is this big variety of approaches in psychological therapies, and not all of them are evidence-based. And if there is one that parents should be aware of, it is called, as I said, trauma-focused cognitive behavior therapy.
Interesting. It's you're saying about this huge infrastructure and very inspiring for children, but talking to the army people, adults, and speaking with those who went through captivity in Russian prisons, and quite often they say the psychologist or the specialist they seen are not up to help them, and they are struggling and they are very skeptical about it. What's your take on psychological help from this side in Ukraine at the moment?
Well, I'm not a big specialist in that specific field because I'm a child specialist, but I can just say a few things. From what I can gather, soldiers and people with military experience tend to respond a lot better to therapists who are also soldiers and have military experience than somebody who's never had anything to do with the war. Not always, but I think that is an important factor to bear in mind. So if I were in charge of planning that work in Ukraine, I would definitely focus on veterans and people with combat experience, and maybe train them in psychological therapies. I also suspect strongly that many psychologists who work, who have like at least 3 years of experience now of full out in a huge war, probably have gathered a lot of experience in what works and what doesn't work. And I suspect that many psychologists and psychiatrists from Ukraine will be quite valuable for future conflicts in other countries because of all of that experience. So I remember talking to some military psychologists in the beginning who literally had no idea what they were doing with soldiers, and so one of them was telling me, "Look, all I can do is give them cigarettes and chocolate. I have no idea what to do with them." And so, but I strongly suspect this is no longer the case, and people who work with soldiers, have got interesting experience, difficult experience, but experience it is. Plus, many of them, I'm sure, by now would have received some training in evidence-based psychological therapies. And so overall, I think the picture must be a lot better than in the beginning of the war. Second thing to say is that even if these prevention programs are very good and well-resourced, like in what we saw, for example, in the States after some of the major wars in Canada, nonetheless, implementing them is not easy, even if you have loads of money for these kinds of things. Many people who require them the most don't use them. And there's a slight paradox there where People who are less affected are more likely to use than people who are more affected, especially the ones who use substances and drugs and alcohol a lot. There is still stigma in the military. Seeing a psychiatrist or a psychologist is seen as a weakness. It still seems to be the case in the UK as well as in other countries, but I think less so. And I'm very glad that a lot of my friends who are veterans in Ukraine are not like that. A very good friend of mine who is currently actually in the UK, who had 3 major injuries during since 22 and was going through a rehabilitation. He just completed a traverse of the Atlantic Ocean with his friend on a boat, a rowing boat. They just went from Gran Canaria to Barbados and flew back to the UK. And so he is very open about his difficulties, and he draws. His Instagram page is full of beautiful pictures that he draws, and he talks very openly about his psychological and physical problems. And so that is something that I'm really glad when it happens, and I suspect that more and more people will be like that.
Sort of having a healthy approach to all the horror they went through. I know you avoiding and trying to sort of like stay away from the speculation and sort of marking the diagnosis to those people we see the most on the news. And I won't go into specifics, and because there's on YouTube, there's a lot of, for everyone to speculate that this is the narcissist or this is psychosis and then this. But do you see when sort of, for example, some meetings or some press conference or some actions or decisions, and you look at the news and you think, oh, that's the patient would be of mine or my colleague, because you are for the children. So do you see those things? Or for psychiatry, obviously it needs further contact rather than media appearance.
Like any human being, I have my hypotheses, but as you rightly say, I don't share them with other people because it's not very professional. What I think, though, to say, which I think might be important, is, I see a lot of children who might develop, some of the more sort of complex personality types. What strikes me always is that you have a variability in these people's constitution, how they are, their bodies. And for example, many psychopathic people, when I see them when they're children, they are very striking. So these children very often don't respond emotionally to some of the greatly emotive material, and it's very striking when it happens. The reactivity of their nervous system is such that they could do very cruel things and very difficult things with almost no emotional or physical reaction. That's a very striking thing. Now, what I would say also is that that in itself is not enough to produce psychopathology, like we might speculate could be seen in some of the people you have in mind, because that by itself doesn't make you a criminal. It doesn't make you somebody who enjoys or could easily send hundreds of thousands of people to their death, or millions, perhaps in some cases. Because you need to also have a particular upbringing, a particular environment when you grow up. Because most children who are not very reactive, they're called callous unemotional traits. They become, typically speaking, they could become very important and functional parts in our society. They could become doctors, surgeons, They could become somebody in the military, pilots,
Politicians
perhaps
have to
politicians,
meet in the
CEOs,
Oval Office.
CEOs. Well, and so my point is that if you have that sort of constitution as a child, but the right environment, then you could become a very useful member of the society. And typically, you might engage with sort of professions that require small reactivity to very emotionally or physically challenging things. And so there is a role for these children in any society. What I think becomes a problem if that sort of constitution is met with difficult, especially early environment, with invalidating environment or aggressive environment, where the child learns that violence is a solution to some problems. And because they are so, relatively speaking, unresponsive to other people's suffering, that becomes a real problem for them, because then they enjoy this, they can see that they can get to their goals by violence, manipulation, intimidation, and this kind of thing. And so that then could produce, psychopathology of a kind that you have in mind. And so my point is that, I see these children. I've seen many of these children, in their childhood. I very much remember one boy who must have been 9 or 10. I saw him with a colleague who is a clinical psychologist, and he did. I'm not going to go into detail, but he did some horrible things to people. And then, as part of the assessment, the question was whether he was autistic or not. But as part of the assessment, he told me and my friend, my colleague, that what he should do is he loved dogs. So he said, what I need to do in life, I need to go to the mountains, some mountains, and live there with my dogs, just by myself. And I thought it was a very interesting sort of idea in this child's mind, because he really struggled with the society. So sometimes these children could be very insightful into how difficult it is for them to fit in without causing very substantial suffering and sometimes death to other people.
Do you feel sorry for the psychopaths who becoming the monsters for the humanity or for the global community?
Well, I don't use that terminology particularly, but I feel that many of these people, there is something in their childhood that went wrong, and there is a hope that as we become, paradoxically, it's not obvious in Ukraine, but paradoxically overall, human beings become less violent. Certainly, if you look at the number of murders in the UK now and say 100 years ago, there's no comparison at all. So this, in general, at least Western societies become less violent over time. Then the hope is that many more of these children will find functional solutions in the society, and fewer will end up in prisons or in positions where they can manipulate and kill, thousands of people. That's the hope.
You in the UK quite some time, and you established a name for yourself. You have fantastic career. You integrated very well in the UK, but you keep doing a lot for Ukraine. And not a long time ago, you ran a marathon in Arctics, and you were crowdfunding money for the ambulance for Ukraine. It's quite inspiring because I've seen it when it's happened, and there were a few media coverage of it after you've done. And there's today when I was getting ready for our interview, is there something that, for example, our viewers or listeners could help you or could help Ukraine that you would recommend or offer or suggest to, because Ukraine still needs aid support on different levels, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, obviously, it's not difficult to find reputable charities to donate to if your colleagues or listeners listen to this. I would also say that a very important part of what anybody could do is just not to forget about Ukraine. There is something about any war, not just Ukrainian war, but any war, that the longer it goes on, the fewer people get into this. And it's partly a function of media. Obviously, when you have less media coverage, as a journalist, I'm sure you're aware of this, then it's less on people's minds. Occasionally Putin does something very cruel, and then all of a sudden you have this in the media, but it becomes less and less. And so, but the war is going on, and people are dying in huge numbers every day. And it's something that I really would encourage your listeners not to forget, and just to keep it in mind, and to make sure that them and their politicians don't forget us. Maybe once in a while they could write a letter to their MPs, members of parliament, just to remind them to vote the right way about the military aid that Ukraine needs more than ever now, especially with what Trump is doing. And just to bear in mind, and to do, like, maybe if every listener will do like one little thing, like a letter to the MP, that would be a huge thing. And also, it's good for your soul, I think, because if you just sit there, watch these horrible news, as you were saying in some of your examples, and just feel helpless, then that's a horrible state to be in. But if you do something, especially with other people, maybe organize some sort of small fundraising for one of the charities, or do something political, or go join one of the protests that happen in most capitals in Europe, just to make sure that politicians remember about the war and it's not over. Then it will be good for your soul too.
Dennis, you wrote several books. One of them about the self-harm in children, teenagers, which is your field, the speciality, and I understand it's for the specialist who sort of your colleagues. But the other book, one of the other books, it's about Galicia and 100 years of Galicia, and you reflecting on what your family went through, on German Nazi concentration camp, on Soviet concentration camp, Gulag, or the sort of like participate in different wars, surviving through the wars. Why did you feel the need living in the UK? So you kind of like withdrawn away from the Ukrainian patriotic moods and needs and everything. Why did you feel the need to write the book about Galicia and reflect on your family history?
It is quite confusing because there are two Galicias. One is in Spain, and another one is in Ukraine. And so I actually received loads of emails from Galicians from Spain saying, what is it that you're writing about Galicia? Like, and I'm Galicia. So it's a bit confusing. Actually, interestingly, might come from the same Celtic root, the names of both places. But so I always enjoyed history and still do. And we have another book which is just published about the next 20 years that led up to the war. A big part of this is because I wrote it with my daughter, who has just finished history. She is literally only just finished her degree in Scotland, and just started working. It's her third week, so we're trying to support her with this kind of thing. But so if anybody has a daughter of the right age, I would highly recommend writing with them. It's a big pleasure, and she spent a lot of time with some of the archives in Ukraine. She speaks Ukrainian and reads it too. It's a wonderful joint family thing that anybody who has some inclination towards this kind of thing could do. It's also quite interesting because some of these stories will disappear quite soon, and unless we capture them in some ways. And I was really quite keen not to lose some of these amazing stories, for the next generation. So as you were saying, interestingly, my grandma and my wife's grandma were both members of this sort of underground resistance army in the west of Ukraine.
UPA?
UPA, yes. And my grandma she was a nurse in that army. And she got captured by the Russians and sent to the Gulag for many years. And my wife's grandma, who was a financier, she was sort of selling these sort of insurance, these sort of bonds to people. Then she got caught by the Germans, and she got sent to the German concentration camp. And so you have these quite interesting sort of stories in the same family, where people would end up, one in Mordovia and one in Ravensbrück in Germany. So I think these stories are quite interesting because they're sort of first-hand stories, and I was still able to interview these people and about their experiences, and that's a valuable thing for the future as well. Because as you say, there is nothing like an eyewitness account of what happened. Because you can always read things in books and wonder how much of this is true and how much of this has been massaged, these data and so on. But if you have like a human being in front of you who just describes, I have to say quite reluctantly, both of them, what actually happened to them. Interestingly, one of them could never look at the German Shepherd without dread, because obviously Russian guards were using these dogs to attack people. And the other one could not see the sign Siemens, because she was actually weirdly working at a Siemens factory in Germany. So in that concentration camp. So these
Nazi billionaires.
There you go.
It's one of those families who made money.
There you go. Yeah. So so it's interesting, how many decades after their experiences, they were still really obviously affected by relatively innocuous and small things. In different ways.
Dennis, and my last question. We established that you like British funerals. Among many things I'm sure you enjoy in the UK. But what do you love the most about Ukraine? Living so far and having a good life here and being very happy here. But what do you like the most about Ukraine?
I will say something that will not be very obvious, but I often think about this. And as I said, I'm a member of Ukrainian Scouts and have been for many, many years, since 1990, in fact, since before the collapse of the Soviet Union, when they were just being reintroduced to Ukraine. And so I have a group of boys. In fact, one of them is texting me as we speak today. I'm sure they have some interesting ideas. Might go to the mountains called Brecon Beacons next weekend. Anyway, and as part of this thing, we had a lot of singing, and singing is a big part of Ukrainian tradition anyway, but especially Scouts, because we always sing around the campfire and on any occasion, basically, we sing. And so one thing that I really miss the most is singing with my friends in the mountains, in Karpaty, in the west of Ukraine, around the campfire. And we especially love a particular kind of Ukrainian folk songs, which comes from Lemkivshchina, from a really sort of very sort of westernmost part of the Ukrainian nation. And they have very interesting songs, very ancient, with very interesting language as well. And I know loads of them, dozens of them. And in fact, we were just singing some of them yesterday because we had a big gathering of friends. But there's nothing like doing it with my friends in Ukraine, in the mountains, and that's the number one thing I miss.
Oh, are you coming from Lemke?
You are? No, I'm not.
Are you?
No, I'm not. Obviously, on my mom's side, people come from a place called Peremyśl, which is now in Poland, but that's not quite Lemke. But Lemke is it's just they have these incredible songs, which
Oh,
I some of them are really quite tragic and sad. But I cannot imagine. I can't think of another sort of relatively small population remote in the mountains that would produce this incredible number of these beautiful, sometimes very long songs. There are some songs that I don't think anybody knows all of the verses to them.
Ukrainian mountain is quite magical. It has a special. It's quite tall and it has very magical atmosphere. And my last time, quite very long time ago, before I got married, and there was winter, and they're so beautiful. And I came with friends, and they were sort of very keen skiers. But a part of skiing for me was just important, just to walk and to feel the atmosphere, because it's you can't compare or describe unless you're there. It's just like it's the air around you, the smells, everything's so thick and so sort of empowering.
I agree, and people as well. I think some
And
of the mountain
mushrooms.
people, yeah, but yeah, exactly. But people are also very special as well. They're very proud people, often with very beautiful culture, which is still maintained. So if you go to Kosi or to some other places, you'll still see. Some of this will be questionable, but some of it will be very authentic,
Yeah.
and you can still see people who do these incredible crafts. Very beautiful, and I really have a lot of time for just talking to people to Hutsula, to other. It's extraordinary how beautiful their culture is, and how proud and independent and really incredible people they are.
Yeah. Oh, thank you, Denisa. Thank you very, very much. And I will leave all your books, the links to it, and the new one. Please do send me under the video in description. And I'm so grateful for this conversation.
It's a huge pleasure. Thank you so much. And as I said, if people wanted to watch more about some of this work, I have a YouTube channel which I'm also happy to share. And if there are some professionals who are listening to this, then I said we do these free training sessions for people who work with kids. Be delighted to invite you and host you.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you. Thank you very much. And enjoy the rest of your Sunday.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the conversation and you have something to say. Please check the links below as the YouTube for Denis Ougrin, his books. And what do you think about conversation? Is there something you would like to share or you would like to ask? We will discuss this conversation, and thank you for your time. And please do like, share, subscribe. It helps to develop my channel. I'm Jenny Klochko, and take care.